For millions of years, humans thrived as nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. It was only around 10,000 years ago that a few societies around the world began to experiment with sedentism, agriculture, and the hoarding of resources. These societies spurred feedback loops of growth, inequality, and environmental devastation, conquering and colonizing and domesticating everyone and everything in their path, causing the sixth largest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. Today, we live in a world that is a mismatch with our evolution in more ways than one. We feel disconnected, isolated, and powerless. Can we find our way back to a life that better matches how humans ought to live? What can we learn about how to live well from other cultures who had it figured out? Is there time to reverse our self destructive trajectory? How can we reclaim our wildness? These are the themes of the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewild workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. For millions of years, evidence suggests that humans lived in relatively equal societies, where food acquisition and child raising were shared activities among community members, both men and women, together. It is apparent that our environments of evolutionary adaptation selected for humans with ever more prosocial traits. Domination and competition were minimized in favor of collaboration and partnerships of mutual aid. The idea that any human was superior to another would have been an absurdity. Contemporary forager societies also exhibit collective regulation of resources and power, diminishing anyone who may try to take more than their fair share or exhibit dominance over others. Only within the last 10,000 years or so does the evidence show that a smaller number of societies turned to systems of domination, who then conquered the world and created hierarchies of rank, class, and everything else. Rewilding is an endeavor to live more closely to how we evolved to live, and in order to do so, we must dismantle the mismatched environment that these dominating societies have created. How and when did this switch to domination happen? Why did it happen? And is it possible to work our way back to egalitarianism? These are central questions to the rewilding movement, and they also happen to be the life's work of anthropologist Douglas Fry, who has come on the podcast to discuss this with me. Dr. Fry is a researcher at AC4 at Columbia University and professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He earned his doctorate in anthropology from Indiana University in 1986. Dr. Fry has written extensively on aggression, conflict resolution, and war and peace. He is currently researching how clusters of neighboring societies and peace systems manage to live without war. He has authored countless academic journal articles on the subjects and has written many books such as Beyond War, The Human Potential for Peace, as well as serving as co-editor of Keeping the Peace, Conflict Resolution and Peaceful Societies Around the World, and Cultural Variation in Conflict Resolution, Alternatives to Violence. His most recent book, Nurturing Our Humanity, is co-authored with Riane Eisler. Eisler and Fry argue that the path to human survival and well-being in the 21st century hinges on our human capacities to cooperate and promote social equality, including gender equality. Doug, thank you for coming on the Rewilding podcast.
It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
First, let's set the stage by talking about what is your perspective on human nature. For example, are we predisposed to certain behaviors, or are we completely clean slates that are shaped by culture, or some combination of both? What evidence is there to back up your theory, and are these theories generally agreed upon within anthropology these days? A real simple question, I know.
Well, thank you for that question. Um, I have a take on human nature, which I would say is not unique by any means, but it is anthropological in a sense, and it's also interdisciplinary. And the reason I say that is I'm trained as a biological anthropologist. As an undergraduate, I also did a degree, an undergraduate degree in experimental psychology. And
Mm.
then I found myself, after getting my PhD, doing field work in Mexico with the basis of it, really drifting more towards social cultural anthropology. So I have a knowledge base, I guess,
Mhm.
coming at this from different angles. And the reason
Mm.
this is important, within anthropology, just to be very simple, there's a large school, or has been until recently, of cultural anthropologists who tend to really emphasize strongly culture learning and be even afraid of, in some circumstances, or at least wary and not happy with biological explanations. So, with my training in biological anthropology and evolutionary theory, I have an appreciation for biological evolution, which many of my colleagues in cultural anthropology do not. Um, and it's also an interest of mine.
Mm.
I think there's a lot to be explained, and it's just fascinating to find all sorts of biological
Mm.
facts about humans and mammals and so forth. So, really, my own perspective is to blend these disciplinary perspectives and not see them in contrast or conflict with each other. Um, Having said all of that, it's really clear that humans are an incredibly flexible
Mm.
species. And I'll use peaceful societies on one extreme and aggressive societies on another extreme as a continuum. If you look cross culturally, which is something, one of my many interests is peaceful societies, you find that some societies are just so incredibly nonviolent in their
Mm.
daily interactions that it's just really hard to fathom how can
Mhm.
these people live this way.
Mhm.
And they do. They're well documented by different anthropologists on different continents and so forth. But I like to call this the aggressiveness, peacefulness continuum because you can sort of arrange roughly society is along this continuum, and you end up with some very violent societies. Now, the thing is, even when you get over there, the most violent ones that have been recorded, where you get, for instance, rape going on, you get spearings, you get constant feuding in some cases. It's different scenarios depending on the culture and the environment itself. But the point is, there's a lot of aggression, a lot of homicides, and so forth. Even then, you can live many days, write the anthropologist, without seeing any acts of violence. So these are sporadic
Mm.
incidences
Mm.
which are
Mm.
deadly. Um, so this is informing my answer as well here, if you see
Mhm.
where I'm going with this.
Mhm.
It's not a question of total chaos, no society existing, everybody, war against all, as Hobbes, to paraphrase Hobbes.
Yeah.
It's not actually that, even in the most aggressive societies, the most violent societies. There's this continuum.
Mhm.
And then, of course, we can add the time dimension also, which is very interesting. And I think we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that later on, perhaps. But
Mhm.
the further back in time you go, the less social complexity there is. And we have these nomadic forager bands, which are so important that you're well familiar with and talking about. My argument here, and it's an evidence-based argument. I want to put that. I noticed in your question you said my theory or my opinion or something. I don't mean to sound snobby, but this is a distinction.
Yeah.
This is a distinction I make between people who argue that there's war forever backwards, as my colleague Brian Ferguson likes to put it, um, and Brian and I, for instance, who actually look at the archaeology and see, well, war started here at this time, relatively recently in this region, and in this other region, it started a little bit later, but it started. There was a condition. Archaeology tells us the evidence, right, that there was no war, and then there was social complexity coming in, and there was some war, and then now all war broke out and it spread and so forth. So what I'm calling for in this sort of long-winded, you asked several questions in there, so excuse me, being
No, that's
long-winded.
great.
Uh, I would say that as a species in human nature, we're very flexible. So we're very capable of acting very violently, selfishly, and so forth. But we're also very capable of showing empathy and compassion and so forth. Now, which is more typical or more normal? I conclude that it's the prosocial tendency in humans that is played out regularly, and that it has been very important in the course of our species evolution and for our species survival. Another aspect of why are we flexible, we have such a long period of infant dependency,
Mm.
hence learning, hence brain development. These things are all what different ways of getting at the flexibility element. Newborn baby could not survive right away. Each one of us came out of the womb and we needed others from that very first breath we took. And apologies to some colleagues I won't name, but we didn't come out of the womb with holding spears and bows and arrows.
Right.
So we have that capacity, but humans are a social species, and we need each other, and we're learners par excellence, and we learn the cultural values, and we learn the appropriate ways to behave for given cultural circumstances. And even in the most aggressive cultures, there's a lot of prosocial activities, a lot of cooperation still going on. And in the very peaceful societies, and sort of the average in the middle, they're much more tranquil on a daily basis of social life than they are aggressive. So, there's different ways to get at this. You mentioned something about data to support. I mean, just think for a minute about how we count homicides. The nowadays accepted way to do it is per 100,000 people, how many homicides were there, right? It's not how many homicides were there in a year for 100 people,
Mm.
or even
Mm.
1,000, or even 10,000. No, it's per 100,000. And then you get a number, right? And again, depending on the country and the time period
Hmm.
involved, the numbers are relatively large or relatively small, but a very high homicide rate comparing countries now might be, say, 50 per 100,000 per year.
Hmm.
Finland, where I lived for quite a while, is sort of around 4 per 100,000 per year for a very long time. United States has gone up. It's been close to 10 in past decades. I'm not sure what it is right now. That's an easy one to just check, but it went down for a while, and even with our mass murders and so forth. So
Hmm.
we're talking a behavior, homicide, that has a big impact socially. It's sad. Someone has lost their father, mother, brother, cousin, aunt, friend, neighbor. It has a big impact, and it's regrettable. But in terms of numbers, we're counting it as a very infrequent type of event in whatever society we're talking
Totally.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, just sort of a balancing of perspective as to what's the significance of all of this.
Yeah, it makes me think about, your emphasis on the difference between homicide versus warfare, and how I don't know if you want to just talk about that for a second too, in terms of like the evidence. Because I think of years ago, I was having this conversation with somebody, an argument, and they were like, "Well, you need to read this book called Constant Battles by, I think it was Stephen LeBlanc or somebody. That's is all the subtitle is like The Myth of the Peaceful Savage or something along those lines. So I tried reading that book, and it was clearly essentially it felt like propaganda. It didn't feel like the evidence. And this is why I asked you the question about like the evidence, because you read some of these books and they appear as if they're citing instances of the evidence, or even like Steven Pinker, or who these people who are making these claims that warfare has always been around, or whatever it is in particular that they're trying to say. And then when you look at the sources that they've cited, or you get into the nitty gritty, it's clear that they're not actually going to data. They're like not sometimes they're literally making things up, or they're cherry picking societies that will then back up their claims. So, what is the difference between violence, homicide, and warfare, and how do you like classify those as to determine whether or not like a society is more peaceful or less than another?
I'll just start by saying, I mean, that's one of the key issues that muddles this whole thing is people use different definitions for warfare,
Yeah,
some very inclusive and some very narrow, and then we all haggle over this and that and the other thing, academics and so forth. But I think the essence of your question is, and in my writings, I'll say, I always like to use the definition that the person on the street, so to speak, goes, yeah, that sounds like war to me. So, for instance, I found a pretty specific definition of war that hits the key elements, I think. Uh, it involves different communities. It's not just within a community, it's different communities. It involves multiple people on both sides, not just one on one, right? Uh, let's see what else here. It has the intention of causing injury or death to multiple people in the other group. And it's not specified, we want to kill that particular person because he ran off with my wife or whatever, right?
sure.
It's just like So,
Yeah.
it's intercommunity, it's intergroup, intention is to kill, and you're not aiming at somebody in particular. It's a group phenomenon. It's an easy way to put it. So for me, that works because it works anthropologically,
Hmm.
and this is our understanding of what war is. Homicide, I think, is there can be multiple perpetrators to a homicide,
Hmm.
but generally speaking, there's one victim, and generally speaking, there's one perpetrator, and so forth. But the real question for me is what's the evolutionary significance of all of this? And many people like Stephen LeBlanc in the book you mentioned, Constant Battles, have a clear understanding that war goes forever backwards. We're a cussed species, as my grandfather used to say sometimes. Hobbes jumped on that
Hmm.
bandwagon, right? Even
Hmm.
before my grandfather was born. Life is nasty, brutish, and
Hmm.
short, and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. So there's very much a predominance, whether we're talking about pop culture, within scientists, even within anthropology and archaeology. There's the predominance to take a Hobbesian view, although people don't always, bang their chests and say I'm a Hobbesian, but they just have learned this as part of the
Hmm.
culture, the Western culture that they've come up with. An eminent anthropologist who's passed away, Martin Solons, um, he wrote a very little book. It's more of a pamphlet than a book, but he traces the origin of this type of belief not just back to Hobbes and not back to St. Augustine, for that matter, justifying war, but all the way back to the ancient Greeks, some
Hmm.
elements of ancient Greek culture in any ways. So it's a very long-standing 2,000 years or so
Hmm.
worldview that's been
Hmm.
impregnated, and I would argue also perpetrated
Hmm.
purposely by some
Hmm.
individuals to
Hmm.
maintain militarism and so forth. It fits nicely. Well, we better prepare because they're a nasty lot and they're going to get
Hmm.
us, and we need a strong defense. And you've heard all these arguments and so forth. So there's political and social consequences to these worldviews. Okay, so anthropologists. I mentioned Brian Ferguson in passing. I want to give a shout out to him. He is really, in my opinion, the anthropologist of war. He spent his career at Rutgers University, Newark, just out of New York City. And he just knows so much and has written so much and is calling out this type of Hobbesian interpretation and belief and everything across the course of his career. One of the interesting articles that he wrote is in War, Peace, and Human Nature, a book I edited. He called it Pinker's List. So you mentioned Steven Pinker also. Um, it's a wonderful article for giving the evidence and pointing out some of the things you were asking, because Pinker's List starts with it's referring to better angels of our nature.
Hmm.
In chapter 2, Pinker actually gives two lists. He gives an archaeological list that supposedly shows ancient examples of, and here comes the definitional issue, violent death, sometimes, war, sometimes, violence, sometimes. And I don't know if he's just being sloppy with his terms or if he's sort of doing this on purpose to
Right.
muddle the idea and make it seem like, well, there's one skeleton with an arrow in the thigh bone of this at this site at this time, and it might be warfare, you know what I mean? So,
Hmm. Hmm.
okay, so that's sort of back to your key issue.
Hmm.
But Brian's article has been well received. He points out there's 21 cases on Pinker's list archaeologically of so-called violent death war going way back. And first point he makes is, well, first of all, they're not going way back. They're not really that old. And interestingly, the oldest one from 16,000 years ago, just yesterday in
Oh,
evolutionary
wow.
time, actually has a zero rate of violent death warfare,
Yeah.
nothing. It's just a
Yeah.
zero. And
Yeah.
I looked at that. I thought, well, wait a minute. What's going on here? You could find 100 sites, really old sites, much older than that, with zero
Hmm.
violence. Why don't you put all those in your list? Okay,
Right.
obviously that's not the point
Right.
he's trying to make.
Yeah.
But here's a date 1600, which is older than when people, generally speaking, accepted war sort of arrived, unless you're taking the perspective it goes forever backwards, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's just a red herring, or
Hmm.
people will see 16,000, go, oh wow, and not look at how much war? Oh, zero. So it's
Yeah.
actually ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, there's 21 sites listed, and Brian dissects it all, and he managed dissects, not. I think that sounded a little funny. That's why I'm clarifying.
Yeah.
Um, he eliminates 7 of them as either redundant cases
Hmm.
or just one victim. That's not war, other problems, and so forth. So it's an interesting dissection. Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope you got some answer out of me on
Yeah,
that one too.
that was great. Um, Yeah, I think my next question was just going to be, defining terms anyway, and so we kind of we sort of started that. But I'm
Sure.
wanting you to kind of clarify or explain in nurturing our humanity. You and Dr. Eisler introduced some specific vocabulary, and you've kind of talked about it a little bit already. But can you explain the meaning behind what you refer to as partnership societies versus domination societies? Like, what are the intricacies of those, and how do they create this spectrum that you mentioned a little while ago?
Okay, so uh, partnership and domination, these are concepts that Riane Eisler coined in a landmark book that came out in the late 80s, I think it was 87, called The Chalice and the Blade. And to get to the core of the concept, she talks about this sort of dichotomy at that time between different types of society. When I had the pleasure and the absolute joy of writing with Rianne recently, the book you mentioned, Nurturing Our Humanity, we talked it out and agreed that it could be more accurately referred to as a continuum, where there are very partnership-oriented societies on one end of a line, and as you go forward, you get sort of a mix, and then you end up on the other extreme with domination societies. So I think that's a more accurate or better model. And also, Rianne is a very interdisciplinary thinker, as am I, if you haven't picked up on that by the way I'm talking. And we really try to pull in a lot of different evidence. So when we talked about it in Nurturing Our Humanity, these concepts, I mean, we added terms like biocultural and epigenetic being sort of an implied causal background to these things. So, it's always both, right? It's not
Hmm.
nurture or nature. It's
Hmm.
both. It's not biology or society. It's both. And what's interesting there is how these multiple factors interact. So we'll come back to that if you like. We can explore it further. But partnership societies, well, let's start with domination first. We'll start with domination. They're based on hierarchy. There's ranking of individuals. This is occurring within the society overall. It's also occurring within different institutions of the society. We are so used to ranks and hierarchies, it's just second nature. You think of your elementary school, there's the principal, then there's the teachers, then there's the teacher aide, and then, of course, at the bottom are the little students that don't really have any. All right, and we can just look at a hospital and do the same thing. So there's these rankings within institutions, but of course, there's within the society, somebody's on top, and so it goes down the corporate ladder or whatever.
Hmm.
So hierarchy is one real element of domination. But beyond that, acceptance of people at the top having special or enhanced privileges, having more wealth, having more access to resources, whether it's healthcare or whatever it is. So the ranks are not just in and of themselves, but they correlate with standards of living and happiness of living and so forth. A big element of the ranking that Rianne has emphasized as a feminist thinker is that men are generally placed above women in domination societies. And again, this is why we sort of went to a continuum because it's not the case in every single society that men are highly placed above women, but there are many societies, there's grades of this. And to get at that idea, the United Nations periodically compares countries and they look at a variety of different measures as to gender equality. And then they come up with a ranking of the countries they've looked at around the planet. And some country is rated as the least hierarchical or the most equal between males and females, and I'm stuck on the traditional gender dichotomy, and this is a biological sex is
Hmm.
what these statistics are talking about. Um, and so in the past, these countries have happened to have been, for the most part, in the Nordic lands, the Nordic countries, and then it goes on down. And it just looks like all sorts of things, from politics to healthcare to
Hmm.
social elements to salaries. It's a very inclusive type of ranking. So with the domination society, you get men most dominant, more so. What we can add next is an ethos or a narrative, a point of view about violence, abuse, exploitation. That's all good stuff in a domination society. That's just part and parcel. That's how humans are. That's acceptable. Yeah, no, it's even a good thing
Hmm.
in some
Hmm.
circumstances. So you see, partnership now is going to be basically contradicting everything I just said.
Hmm.
We'll just start with the lack of strong dominance hierarchies. There can be some hierarchies, right? But the idea is they're not just like set in concrete and this is the way it always will be, and so on and so forth. To the contrast, there's more element on everybody is a human being, everybody is equal. That's our ideal. This is what we try to implement in this society. These are our core values and our beliefs. Men and women, yeah, don't put one sex over the other. They're different. I think that's generally acknowledged. But when you have biological men, biological women, they both contribute. It's not a question of one sex being superior and therefore getting access to more valued commodities or
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm.
Again, the aggression, well, the partnership orientation, they tend not to be totally naive in most contexts and say, oh, everything is fine here, have a flower. No, they understand that aggression and exploitation are lurking
Hmm.
and should be keep an eye on that. That's not good. Speak against it when you can. A specific example I think of from Norway is where Norwegian homicide rate is extremely low and has been traditionally. It's crept up a little bit in recent decades, unfortunately. But it's one of the lowest homicide rates of a country. And when there was a racial incident outside a bar and someone was killed, it's like the country just went on a series of candlelight vigils and
Mm.
conveyed that this is not acceptable,
Yeah.
that we don't accept this. So this is what I'm getting at in terms of like attitudes and norms in partnership societies. What they do value and what they do accept, quality, as I said at the beginning, that's central, but also treating people with respect, sharing of resources, showing compassion, all sorts of prosocial behaviors and
Hmm.
activities, right?
Hmm.
And we can get more specific if you like now or later, but there are countries that are modeled on this. They do exist. So I'm not just talking pie in the
Yeah.
sky.
Yeah.
Um, and then finally, the narrative is different, right? We talked about the domination narratives that it's okay. No, it's not okay to be
Hmm.
violent, to be exploitive, to have slaves, to slavery by a different name or whatever. No, that's
Hmm.
just not
Hmm.
acceptable. That's not what humans are supposed to do in a partnership society. We're supposed to work together for the good of all in the society. And again, the institutions can reflect this as well.
Thank you. Um, yeah, and now my next question is, what are the material conditions that lead us to one or the other?
Okay, well that's going to be that's a very interesting question, first
Yeah.
of all. And you may or may not be disappointed with my answer about it. I'm going to go in two different directions. And the
Hmm.
first one's going to go back to our big picture of humanity evolving, the nomadic forager bands, and what happened more recently. Uh, in nurturing our humanity and in elsewhere with my wife, who's also a scholar, Genevieve Suyak, we wrote a couple of pieces about the foragers, and with Genevieve, we called it the original partnership societies. And these are small bands. They're mobile or nomadic. They don't have really many material resources. So this is your first answer, right?
Hmm.
So if they're the original partnership societies and they don't really have much material resources or materialism, for one thing, there's not much to fight over in that regard. And in fact, if you look at what sorts of aggression and so forth goes on in these societies, not much really. I've made an argument that warfare is far and few between among nomadic forager societies. It's not the natural case of things. And this is supported by both looking at what's going on in these societies, systematic sampling of them, not just cherry picking them. Again, this is important to draw these
Hmm.
methodological issues out. And also looking at the archaeology and seeing when warfare does come in, as I alluded to earlier. So, in the broader sense of material conditions for domination and hierarchy, we see original partnership societies spanning most of human evolution. And I'll just be simple and say, somewhere around um, up until 12,000, 11,000, 10,000 years ago, and sometimes even more recently, depending on where you're talking about, did you start getting changes? And these changes brought in domination, just to put it simply. I'm not going to bash agriculture totally,
Yeah.
but that is one, you know, as a professor of mine, an anthropology professor long ago once said, the agricultural revolution ruined everything. It's been downhill since then. So in a way that's true. I mean, it's
Hmm.
it's allowed
Hmm. Yeah.
where we are today with all our technology and everything, but it has also brought plagues and war and
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the standard line. There's nothing too new there. What I've noticed in my literature is there's the other path, and that's when these foraging communities get bunched together and crowded. That's one condition. And then there's good resources, usually, well, almost always marine resources of some
Hmm.
sort. And that's a food base that allows a higher population density. And then guess what? Just like agriculture, they start settling down and their population increases and they're even more stressed next to each other.
Hmm.
And someone gets the idea at about this point, well, I could be a chief and I could lead this group over there and attack that group. And then we'd have access to the salmon run because their village is right at the mouth of that river. And the salmon, that's a good example for Portland, I think, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Here's the salmon run. That's a really good place. Why don't we take that? We got enough people now. Come on, guys, get your clubs. We're going. So that's another path. Agriculture, and we call it complexification.
Hmm.
And I think I'm the person that calls it the complexification
Hmm.
complex because it involves a complex of changes
Hmm.
that then lead towards war.
Hmm.
Slavery comes in many cases as well. So, when my old professor said, then it all went to hell, so to speak, with agriculture, it can also go to hell with complexity.
Totally.
And basically, the paths are very similar in terms of the results. You may not get war, strict dominance, rankings, right away, or you might not get slavery right away, but it tends to come in under these conditions. So it's
Hmm.
like, okay, this is bad news, but at least we're getting some understanding of the material conditions, as you say,
Hmm.
and more general conditions as to how this came about as part of a world history when we go back into prehistory as part of the history. So I guess that's the first answer. The second one here, and I'll be more brief with this one, is to look cross culturally at the nations nowadays. And here's, I think, where it's really important to think again about what we humans across cultures value as sort of a human inclination. Back to one of your previous questions.
Hmm.
For me, we want equality. We don't want other people to tell us what to do. It's again a feature of nomadic foragers. They hate to be bossed around and anybody tell them what to do. Chances are they won't follow it
Hmm.
because how's that other person going to enforce it?
Hmm.
Anyway. So so we want to be equal. We don't want to be bossed around. I think these are fundamental human
Hmm.
traits. And domination comes and starts messing with this. And we may fight back or we may just be subservient and take it on. But given our druthers, we'd like to make our own decisions. We'd like to decide simple stuff like, what am I going to eat tonight?
Hmm.
Not have somebody else tell me what you're going to eat tonight. What day am I going to work? Am I going to work hard today? No, I'm not. I'm feeling tired. Well, I got to go anyway.
Yeah.
So we end up with a lot of say human nature tendencies sort of misplaced in domination systems in particular, hierarchical systems more generally. So this other answer is in some societies. Well, let me go at this a different way. I'll share that I lived in Finland and was at the university there for 19 years. So that's a good chunk of my life. And my very first impression when I came to Finland was, no, it's just like the US.
Mm.
And then I started getting a whole series of little surprises and shocks.
Mm.
And no, it's not exactly like the US. But one way that's really important that it's not like the US is Finns really strongly value equality. Sociologists, for instance, remarked that every human being is equal. I'm thinking, I've never heard that in the United States. From a United States person speaking generally, every human
Hmm.
being is equal. I just hadn't heard that, so it sort of, stuck with me. Finn said that. Yeah, Finn actually said that. And then a whole series of conversations and sources about the gender equality in Finland, which is really quite remarkable in many ways. Finland's the second country on the planet where women got the vote. And not only did they get the vote, they also got the ability then to stand for election.
Hmm.
And so right away you started getting women parliamentarians. And the balance is as far as I know, it's not been exactly 50-50 over recent decades, but it's pretty acceptably close. And that's a very interesting question. Why is it 40-60, not 50-50, or why isn't it 60-40 sometimes? So I'll just save that for just putting it out there. There's
Hmm.
there's other factors going on, I think.
Sure, absolutely.
So material conditions, I think a lot of it is how a society chooses to deal with their material, their wealth, and so forth. And it's not divorced, or it shouldn't be divorced from their core values. So Finns, there's no ghettos in Finland. Some people earn less money, but it's not an amount of money you can't live on.
Hmm.
It's like that's not equal. That's not fair. So there's this tension. Yeah, they acknowledge you're a CEO of a big company in Finland. Your job is important. You make big decisions that affect the company and the livelihood of many people who work there. You should get paid more, but not the obscene
Right.
difference between a CEO and an American,
Hmm.
uh, compared to the workers. So, there's things like this that are a bit of a balance. But if you compare point by point, are the Finns acting and creating institutions and practices that are in accordance with equality? Well, let's see, how do they treat their elderly? Let's look at that for a minute.
Mm.
Oh, elderly gets people coming in and helping them for free if they need it. Oh, there's all sorts of senior living establishments, which are either a token fee or free. Let's look at the schools. What's going on there? Every child in Finland gets a free lunch. How more equal can you be?
Hmm.
No, you don't have to be poor to get the lunch. Just everybody gets a free lunch. Well, they're at school, they need to eat, right? So
Right.
all sorts of things start making sense when you just start thinking, well, what are our values and what's the situation? And what institutions are we going to create? What practices are we going to follow? And so on and so forth. So I never say, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying, Finland or any other Nordic countries are like utopia on earth.
Sure.
Every society has its challenges
Absolutely.
ongoing, and every there's always room for improvement, right? We
Hmm.
know that. There's always,
Hmm.
so I'm not making some absolute argument. What I'm trying to do is to point out when you're talking about partnership and domination, that it's not all done in the United States style.
Hmm.
There are other ways to set up where you can have a social welfare state merged with some capitalism. Somehow it works.
Hmm.
Their core values that support equality, compassion, taking care of people, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get to, you get your feet and your hands muddy, there's always going to be some contradictions and some interesting things going on. Let me just mention a couple of these because I just found them really interesting. It's a perennial thing of comparing salaries, right, between men and women. And the perennial difference is, well, there's a difference, but how much of a difference? And so,
Hmm.
okay, guess what? Finland has a difference. Men overall are earning more than women overall. You got to dig a little deeper as an anthropologist. And I don't have any study I could cite on this, but from my own talking to people as an anthropologist, I had a friend who was an archaeologist. So sorry, an architect. Big difference. She was and she told me how she and this man were like right under the chief, and which one of them would be promoted. And she said, it's so funny. He wants that promotion so bad, but I don't tell him I don't want it. I just let him sweat because I want to do the designing. I don't
Hmm.
want the higher salary and the responsibility
Hmm.
because I don't like that. I
Hmm.
like doing architecture.
Hmm.
And so he got the promotion easily. She was happy. He was happy. I sort of came around to the idea that the sex gender roles were really important in this society.
Hmm.
If you look at the number of the salaries for men and women lawyers, you see the same thing. If you just look at numbers, you go, oh God, the women are underpaid. Well, I talked to a couple of women lawyers, and they say, oh, we like to work for the government. Of course, we get less salary, but we do meaningful work. We have low stress, and at 3:45 we get to go home.
Hmm.
And this guy over here at the corporation, yeah, he's learning twice our salary, but look, he's got an ulcer and he has to work evenings.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, I say, when you start digging into some of these things. I'm not using this as a blanket excuse as to
Sure.
why men
Sure.
should be paid more than women. Absolutely not. That's
Right.
not my point at
Right.
all. But my point is that you need to look a little deeper to see how partnership and domination and how the subtleties of equality and so forth are actually being, played out in the
Totally.
society.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect, but there's a whole lot of examples as how caring values are put first.
Absolutely. Yeah. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Rewilding podcast. I wanted to pause and make a request for your support. With so much media filled with misinformation and outright lies these days, small independent outlets like mine are some of the only ones left striving for brave, truthful inquiry. I need your support to continue bringing you thoughtful, hopeful discourse on human resilience. Please become a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thanks for keeping my project going. The world needs this. In Hierarchy in the Forest, a book by Christopher Baim, he talks about the various leveling mechanisms that exist in contemporary hunter gatherer societies to prevent upstarts from taking too much power, and makes the point that even if material conditions leaned toward egalitarianism in those societies, there was still active politicization, so to speak, to prevent anyone from becoming a despot. What are some of the examples of partnership societies that you've witnessed, and how do they actively work to prevent domination from taking hold? Do you see these leveling mechanisms as a kind of blueprint for people in domination societies to work their way back to more partnership-based societies?
Yeah, and I love that book, as we talked about previously. It's a really interesting book, and I just praise Chris Bohm for the amount of work he put into that. The rich examples he gives from nomadic foragers from around the globe are actually four continents, if I remember the detail that he considered. So it's a vast ethnographic book. And of course, it's called Hierarchy in the Forest. He comes up with this key concept of a reverse dominance hierarchy. And he's one of the few anthropologists that worked with chimpanzees and humans. And when he did his work with chimps, he was impressed by a dominance hierarchy there that's pretty obvious. But when he worked with humans, it was even more interesting because you didn't have like a dominant male chimp, a dominant male hunter gatherer, all of a sudden strutting around threatening to beat everybody up. Well, it could happen, but
Hmm.
it tended not to happen. And the reverse dominance hierarchy was if anybody starts getting too full of themselves, trying to boss others around, for one thing, trying to take more than their fair share is another one, just acting antisocially, then the rest of the group acted as if they're dominant. You may dominate this person, or you might dominate that person. You might dominate both of them together, but you're not going to dominate all of us. So this type of leveling mechanism or reverse dominance hierarchy is very apparent in these forager bands. And I think, you could put your finger on a very interesting question there as to, well, why is that and how did it come about and what do we do about it, of course. Um, what humans tend to do in this type of social organization is use all sorts of social control mechanisms. They're really diverse social control mechanisms. They will criticize, they'll make offhanded comments, they will mock somebody in front of their face or behind their back. An interesting one is withdrawal of social support. They will remind them that you need us. We all need to hunt together. If you're such a great hunter, you can hunt by yourself. Well, then go off and hunt by yourself, and let's see how that works out for you. And so it goes. And What I've done in an article that I wrote with Patrick Soderberry, one of my Finnish colleagues, some years ago, is we looked at the different mechanisms that are used in these societies and sort of organized it as a three-tier organization. The first one is you try to raise people to be, in the words of one hunter-gatherer group, good and useful human beings. You pro-socially raise them so that they will be cooperative, a team player, caring, you know, not egotistical,
Hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. And that works most of the time. But, sometimes it doesn't exactly work. And it may not work. Someone gets upset, hot under the collar, maybe an episode, or it may be a more chronic pattern developing. Well, then you really send them the message through these types of social control mechanisms that you're out of line, this is not right, and so forth, including in some cases physical punishment.
Hmm.
Well, you were bad. A case I know from the Australian bush is this young man, he just liked to have sex with inappropriate sexual partners. And the elders told him this was wrong, he shouldn't do it, and he kept doing it. Okay, so finally, after getting the lectures, he acknowledged that he was at fault, and he did this by taking this small shield and just standing out in a clearing. And at that point, his biological and his classificatory or kin brothers came, and they didn't like beat him really severely or anything, but they each took a good wallop at him, and he tried to defend himself a little bit. But he accepted his punishment. He got punished. He stopped
Yeah.
having sex with
Wow.
inappropriate women, and so life went on. So that's sort of the second level. But the third one is where someone just is a recidivist killer
Mm.
or has done other serious breaches of crime and it developed, as Chris Bohm says, a dossier of bad behavior. And everybody knows that dossier. And they will just either ostracize the person outright. Look, you've blown it. You're out of here, or else they'll kill him outright. And some anthropologists talk about this very graphically as porcupining, where everybody in the band that has a bow and an arrow shoots the antisocial, deviant person
Hmm.
full of arrows until he looks like a porcupine. And it's
Wow.
usually a hen, by the way. It's not always, but it's usually a male that gets himself into this fate. Okay, so back to the broader picture here of Chris Bohm and keeping people in order and so forth. That's what's going on in nomadic forager groups. I think you can look at any society, as sociologists have done and anthropologists have done, and every society has the laws and the norms. We don't have written laws, we certainly have the norms, meaning the rules, the correct ways to behave, and the ways you should not behave. This is taught to people. They know that. What happens when it goes wrong? You can exert social pressure. You can, in some societies where there's codes of law, you can, go through the whole judicial process and so on and so forth. Most societies don't necessarily have that, but they call the person to account and there's some sort of grievance hearing. The emphasis from cross cultural conflict resolution is on restoring the relationship and restoring the harmony. It's not on punishing somebody, it's not on kicking somebody out. That's just the method of last resort for these nomadic foragers to boot them out or kill them. And there's really no other opportunity to do anything successfully to rehabilitate them or keep them in the band. So very important human patterns here are emerging. Every society has conflict resolution, and it sometimes involves some physical aggression, but typically not. It's talked out, it's debated, lectures are given by elders. If there's a head man or a head woman, which sometimes there are head women, they weigh in and everybody thinks they speak with wisdom.
Do you see these leveling mechanisms as a kind of blueprint for people in domination societies to work their way back to more partnership-based societies?
And I know
Again,
we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do when you encounter the flaming narcissist and so forth
yeah.
as a real problem for the group. But you see, that's what there's been a human problem like this over millennia as to what do you do about this out of control deviant, this flaming narcissist, this one that always wants the bigger piece of the pie, and so on and so forth. It's an old problem. Um, this was relatively small potatoes. No one was going to drop a nuclear bomb. Um, There were some homicides sometimes, and that's big in these groups. But nowadays, when you have such large number of people under the fate of one antisocial person, it's a huge problem. And I'll say, just I've been surprised. Donald Trump came in. We all know, I don't have to elaborate about the various patterns of behavior that he engages in. And I've just been really surprised. Where are the hunter-gatherer outrage about this? Where are the leveling mechanisms? Where
Yeah.
is the pushback, the effective
Yeah.
pushback? And it blows me away, actually. It's not what I would have predicted. And in fact, I did run my mouth off, during his first term. Sometimes anybody who might listen a little bit here and there as to, well, he's going to get pushback on this. I'm sure he's gotten some pushback, but it's a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, it made me remember what I wanted to mention before, which is in Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. He has a huge section on legitimacy of societies and how the legitimacy is one of the factors that keeps them going or prevents collapse or can cause collapse, right? Like the lack of legitimacy in the state, for example, is one of the reasons why it can start to fail. But I mean, this is true of any society, small or large. The legitimacy of the social contracts between people are what keep them going. And
Yes.
so you mentioned, that in a lot of these hunter-gatherer societies, the values of not wanting to be dominated are such an important aspect of their like social political environment, right? The legitimacy of egalitarianism is essentially what they are fighting for in their own ways through the reverse dominance hierarchy. But when you have this hierarchical society, as you mentioned, there's these values of domination being the right thing to do or the best thing to do. And so I feel
Yes.
like there's that aspect of legitimacy in violence or in warfare in and of itself that is so intrinsic to the society that makes it really hard for people to understand leveling mechanisms. And it's interesting to me as a citizen of the United States, for example, that was allegedly created with these checks and balances. I feel like, humans everywhere, if we are truly sort of like leaning towards pro-social behaviors, which I do believe we are, then even in these state environments, we're still trying to create some forms of leveling mechanisms that can create a better balance, as you've described in countries like Finland. But then what happens is, the legitimacy of those can sort of wane based on these individuals who have the ability to threaten the legitimacy in and of themselves and create their own. I mean, just yesterday, Trump posted a picture of himself as if he were a king, like with a crown on, proclaiming himself to be, the king. I'm the king, or whatever. Um, and he's giving himself the legitimacy of a monarchy, and there are people that are eating it up. And I think in nurturing our humanity, you guys talk about this a little bit too, with the way people are brought up in societies of domination to sort of accept that domination is a legitimate form of socialization and the way of organizing a society, and the importance of, you know, um, essentially detraining people that domination is a legitimate form of social organization, and how important that is. I mean, you focus on a lot of that in that book. And this is just making me feel sort of a different understanding, I think, of recognizing that we have to build the legitimacy of egalitarianism as a value,
Yes.
um, you know, from a young age into adulthood, but also what happens when, we don't have that anymore? What happens when, and I'll jump to the next question, the next formal question here, which was,
Let me comment just a little
okay,
bit on
cool,
your
cool.
comment.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
you got me thinking about some things. So, I mean, one of the wonderful things about anthropology that I've always liked and was drawn towards it is to be able to look at a different culture or different cultures to, and then therefore get a new view of my own culture.
yeah,
Because truisms, you probably heard it of, the fish doesn't know about water.
totally.
So I think to answer your question of, what can you do about this in terms of showing people who are in a domination society or domination context, is to show them some alternative ways of being, ways of living, partnership, and to be specific, or more towards partnership, that can then sort of get them thinking, wow, this could be possible. So I like to, to the extent possible, deal with realities, data, figures, facts, and at the same time, think what are the implications. So that's why we do write, given my personal experience about Finland, but also using drawing on statistics and other factors about certain examples from the non-Western world about partnership societies and how they have a totally different social reality, as well as the nations
Hmm.
that are in this direction. So I think that's one answer. I just sort of wanted to make that
Hmm.
explicit. If people just are stuck in that cultural water, that's how they've been brought up, that's
Hmm.
how everybody thinks, that's how it just is, then that shuts down the possibilities for doing something different or doing something else. And so even just as simple of, well, take a look at a specific example, non-Western or Western or what have you, that's really partnership oriented, and see what's going on and see that higher correspondence of values with the institutions created. Okay, we haven't talked about healthcare, but I mean that's a wonderful example actually of the European countries, including the Nordic lands, including Finland, where they've set up a very egalitarian and relatively low cost healthcare system. I had to have my gallbladder taken out. Suddenly I woke up and oh, the pain, you wouldn't believe it.
Mm.
Well, actually, I had gall sand. Next thing I know, my gallbladder is being taken out. And I knew from talking to people the bill was not going to be huge. In fact, $150 for 4 days in the hospital, the surgery, the anesthesiologist, and the whole kit and caboodle, $150. Even for me, as just someone who's living there, it's like a cost sharing. You can pay 1%, but we value your life. We want to care for you and so on. So that's a very personal example in that case, but it applies across the board and that's equal. So I already mentioned some other examples,
Hmm.
like, well, school lunch for everybody.
Hmm.
It's like,
Hmm.
wow, okay. So, well, I also learned, I'll just mention this in passing and see if some listeners can relate to this. Um, as I would tell some of these stories, either in lectures or just to family and friends coming back to the States, the pat response was, oh, but the taxes are so high over there. Well, actually, I was
Yeah.
living there and paying those taxes too. They're not so high over
Hmm.
there. Guess what? It's a gradated scale, just like in the United States. The more you earn, the more you pay. The difference is when you get to the really rich Finns, of which there are not that many, um, they pay a lot.
Because they
Again,
don't need
equality,
anything else.
leveling, right? This is
Yeah, right.
literally
Exactly.
economic leveling.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
if you're gonna be, literally own a corporation or whatever it is you own or whatever, you're a Finnish millionaire, you're gonna pay. And okay, so that's a
Yeah.
leveling mechanism, the economic level. So
Totally.
again, real cases, real data, real facts to like say it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, we'll probably circle around back to some of that, but there was this one thing that I kept thinking about um, in those sections of nurturing our humanity, where you were exploring this idea of, raising children to have more partnership oriented thinking and feeling. Um, and so I wrote this question out here. You make the case that egalitarian behaviors are something that we can and should teach. While I agree in general, I have this sort of devil's advocate voice in the back of my head that wonders, is teaching a child to lean into partnerships not preparing them for a world of domination? Does this make them more susceptible to being dominated by others? Is there a kind of naivety to teaching children to expect partnership in a world where domination rules? Is teaching self-defense antithetical in that it's teaching violence that could be used to dominate others? And what are the safeguards against this?
Yeah, again, a great question. You are a thinker. Yeah, I don't know if I can really address all the points, but
Sure.
I'll give it a shot here with a few ideas.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think this is a disadvantage to teach partnership. I
hmm
really think it's an advantage to teach
hmm
partnership. Partnership is multifaceted, so as we talked about, but basically having a core value in equality, I think is a good thing. In fact, it can make you angry
hmm
and maybe do something
hmm
when you see somebody breaching this, right?
hmm
If you hadn't been taught it, oh yeah, well, okay, I'm low in the hierarchy and nothing I can. So that's one sort of personal response of individuals thinking this is not right. I don't have to put up with this, et cetera, whatever the context is. Another one that's interesting is to bring in the idea of reciprocity as a pan-human rule of social interaction. And reciprocity goes in different directions, right? I do you a good turn, you feel you owe me one, and hopefully I get paid back sooner or later. Pay back with a delay. Um, if you don't, well, that's okay too. But if I do 10 favors for you and I never get paid back, I'm going to stop doing the favors.
hmm
So generally speaking, human societies are based on a positive reciprocity of good deeds begetting reciprocal good deeds, begetting more good deeds, and so on. And I'm just using good deeds, for any number of favors and services and help and cooperation and what have you. So many societies on this planet, which we hardly ever hear about, are actually running this way all the time and are really set up to be geared towards incurring debts, paying the debts back, cooperating, working together, as just that mindset. And they're partnership societies. Um, they can also, depending on context again, they can also cooperate to defend themselves if the
hmm
next society over is at the border and wanting to come in and burn their fields or whatever.
hmm
So again, the aggressive part of partnership is we don't think it's the best way to go. Aggression, abuse, exploitation, no nos, but we recognize that they do exist. And, it's not really part of the model to say, and therefore we just lie down and give ourselves up and, let them do bad things to us.
hmm
That's not,
hmm
you know, it'd be nice if it was that way, you didn't have to defend yourselves. But I think, at least for myself, I recognize that you need to push back sometimes in your personal life, in your community life, with neighbors out there. And we'll talk a little bit more about peace systems as an interesting expression of some of these ideas, if you like. So let's see. I guess I'm agreeing and disagreeing depending on which part of your
Yeah.
faceted question you're
Yeah.
raising
I
there.
mean, I think you answered it perfectly. And I feel like there's, to me, it's sort of like, yeah, you want to teach partnership because like you say, it's just like I think an intrinsic part of human socialization, but also that there's mutualism that comes from that. And there's, I think, strength from mutualism. I think, also learning self-defense and this gets to the sort of the last big meaty question I think that I had for you, which especially relevant right now is this feeling that in the United States and the places that the United States has hegemony that's being taken away or resources that are being stopped right now because of the administration that is currently in office and their potential for dismantling the checks and balances that have been part of this country for a long time. I wrote this meaty question that I'll that I'll ask you, and then from there we'll switch more to the. I want to ask you about the Sustaining Peace Project and some other of those things before we wrap things up. But this is sort of the last big one, so it feels like the technological apparatus of the state is impenetrable. In The Great Leveler, the author shows that the only times in history where the gap between the rich and the poor has shrunk was after a great calamitous collapse of society. There are many incentives to keep politics the same. Rich, dominating people have the money to pay for the propaganda to keep themselves in power in terms of legitimacy, and payoffs to elected officials. It feels like a feedback loop that can't be broken by nonviolence, because violence, so long as it's supported materially, has more efficacy than nonviolence, and the rich have a material monopoly on violence. Essentially, the world is being held hostage, and it doesn't feel like we can vote or parent our way out of the situation because those holding us hostage don't want to let go of their power and control, even if it benefited them financially. That just I'm just referring to like the 4 day week or whatever, how it's shown that, you can make more money by having people work less hours and things like that. Um, and it doesn't feel like okay, so even if it benefited them financially, there's a kind of sick perversion with domination where it's not really even about the financial gain, it's about the domination. And the domination is the harmful behavior and control of people in and of itself. How can we move from a society based on domination to one based on mutual aid or partnership? I recognize that there are a lot of effective means of nonviolent resistance, as outlined in books like James Scott's Weapons of the Weak. But at what point is violence an appropriate and effective response? And it's okay if you are not comfortable answering this question, but I feel like it has to be asked, even if rhetorically, especially in like the moment that we're in right now, where resistance may end to what's happening may end up escalating to the point of who knows what. So anyway, that that's the sort of last bigger meteor, maybe question that there you may not have the answer to, or there may be
Yeah.
multiple answers or whatever. So what's your take on that?
Well, when I read your question, and thank you for sending me that one ahead of time so I can give a little
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
I think the most useful answer I could give is to question this idea of nonviolence being ineffective or ineffectual, and at least compared to violence. That's come out recently through a series of different studies that nonviolence actually is more effective than violence in terms of boosting out a dictator. Um, and there have been some excellent films, documentary films made. There's some good recent books that sort of support this with case studies and examples. One of the films is Bringing Down a Dictator, for instance, and it talks about how Serbia booted Milosevic out. And it's quite a remarkable story. There's a companion book to this with a crazy title, Blueprint for Revolution by Sergei Popovich. And Sergei Popovich was one of the student leaders at the university in Serbia who was really the mastermind, the college student, right? A mastermind of this nonviolent campaign to get rid of the dictator. So both the film shows it well. The book is a fun and easy read. But these are just like one example that comes to mind of people power.
Hmm.
So I realize we're not necessarily just strictly talking about booting out a dictator. There was a theoretician, Gene Sharp, who really did his own thing. He looked at nonviolence and the effectiveness of nonviolence, and he talked about strategies and tactics for nonviolence. He's got a series of books out. He passed away, I'm just going to guess, about 5 years ago as an elderly man with a rich life. It really gives hope, I think, when you start seeing the success stories around the world of nonviolence working, and you see it in different smaller ways within societies. I think I double checked this. I think it's Dartmouth University has a database of nonviolent actions across history and so forth with like 1,000 cases or 2,000 cases or something crazy. I can help you find out if you're
Sure.
interested.
Cool. Yeah, I would love it.
But they're everything from like strikes at coal mines,
Mm-hmm.
and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So what Gene Sharp pointed out, I'm going to try to get the number right. He listed 198 tactics that could be used. And it's not just go out on the street corner and hold your sign, turn Trump upside down, boot the bastard out, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place for that. That's one. But that leaves another 197 things you can do. economic boycotts, and then all different types of elements of what the subcategories are of how you can do this, and so on and so forth. So, nonviolence has a huge potential, which hardly anybody appreciates or knows about. The CIA apparently did not like what Sharp was talking about. It's an interesting documentary about Gene Sharp also. I'm trying to think what the name of. I think it's called How to Start a Revolution.
Mm,
I could send you some links. You could share them with
cool.
your listeners if you
Yeah, that would
like.
be great. I'd love that.
It's rare when I really see some good documentaries on these topics.
Hmm.
And there are some. And I like the documentaries because it really personalizes it and you see what is happening in front of your
Hmm.
face with real
Hmm.
footage and so forth.
Hmm.
So there's also the academic literature. I brought one book here that's now 10 years old or so, Why Civil Resistance
Mm.
Works. And this is a
Mm.
more scholarly treatment of it. It's by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen. And uh, they're political scientists, basically. But interestingly, they have the twist that they were surprised by their own results.
Mm.
They compared violent revolutions with nonviolent revolutions. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the nonviolent ones were more likely to succeed. The nonviolent ones got more people involved. And when you think about it, that's pretty easy. There's not that many folks who will grab the gun and go running off,
Hmm.
but there are a lot more people who will stand on their balconies and bang pots and
Hmm.
pans across the whole city at 6 o'clock every night.
Hmm.
Pretty safe behavior, but very effective as the whole city is filled with the sound of rattling
Hmm.
cutlery.
Hmm.
So, anyway, that would be one thing to do is to take the nonviolent strategies seriously, really apply them systematically, get this on a mass basis. Just do what the Serbians did, but do it in the United States. It's a fantasy I have, that might someday come true.
Yeah,
Um,
well, things are shaping up in certain ways. Yeah,
yeah, but yeah, okay. So I'm personally not in favor of violence for
yeah,
personal reason.
yeah,
I don't feel that's the best way to go.
yeah.
But here's an argument I'm making that it's not the most effective way to go either, because as soon as you use violence, then the domination thugs have their excuse to wipe you out, right? And that scenario has been played out enough times.
Hmm.
So if you don't give them that excuse and you're
Hmm.
clever about it, I mean, Serbia was a dangerous situation, and they were very clever as to not to really endanger themselves too badly. They used humor, by the way, which was
Mm.
really interesting. At
Hmm.
the end of
Yeah,
the
that's
day, they just
awesome.
threw the bastard out.
Yeah, I mean, I think of things like it's interesting to look at the leveling mechanisms in small scale societies like the ones that you've mentioned of like, non-participation or ignoring people and or first training them as children to be more partnership and then ignoring them and then non-participation and then like publicly humiliation or like just
Yeah,
these different things that eventually can sometimes lead to okay, well, we have to kill this person. And I just think that sometimes, like in the situation like World War II, for example, you have this collaboration of different countries that come together to physically, to violently suppress Hitler and the Nazi Party. And that was effective in and of itself
yeah,
as a coalition, right? So there are these instances where countries come together um, to suppress particular violent other countries or other nations and things like that. And then it just can devolve that way within individual countries with things like the Civil War, here
yes.
in America. And of course, none of us want that to happen. Like all of those things are sort of the last case scenario or worst case scenario, really. And so, yeah, I appreciate all of these links to and all your mentions to effective nonviolent strategies because I think that's the place to start.
I know
And
what I'm going to do real easily. I have a syllabus. I'll just, for the course, I taught the power of nonviolence. I
awesome,
can send that your way, and there
that
you
would be
got kit
great.
and caboodle, and you can decide what looks good
That would be
to
great.
share more generally.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Try to intersect or interject, I should say, a little bit of hope and optimism into these situations. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
That's
that's sort of
important too.
the last two questions. One is just when I searched for you online, one of the first things that came up was the Sustaining Peace Project, which I thought was a really cool project, and your involvement with that. So I was curious, like, what that is, what your involvement was, and then the last question is just like, what gives you hope, and what actions can people take to feel less powerless and more in control, or at least active participants in creating partnership societies. I feel like you've mentioned, I mean, that's sort of something that's just been imbued in this entire conversation, as well as a lot of the resources that you've mentioned. So we don't necessarily need to dwell on that a little bit, but any last thoughts around
Oh, sure,
of hope? But
sure.
first, let's just talk a little bit about the Sustaining Peace Project.
Well, I have a friend and colleague, Peter T. Coleman, who's a professor at Columbia University in New York. And in fall of 2015, so 10 years ago, he reached out to me and asked if I'd like to be a part of this Sustaining Peace project that he was setting up and envisioned to run for 10 years or so. It's still running and going through it's gone through
Nice.
different iterations, a lot of changeover of participants and so on, and then a sort of a steady core. So it's been involved in a variety of different initiatives, put it this way. We've had scholars come in from internationally and the States, and we've done brainstorming sessions. We developed a model with, interestingly, reciprocity sort of at the core. One approach that we're trying to do, it's sort of I would say, a think tank type of academic thing,
Mm.
more than a feet in the mud type of get out there in the
Hmm.
community. Um, the main role that I was thinking, I remember it was either that fall where we first started or sometime thereafter. I was just mulling over, well, what can my contribution to this be? Peter's a psychologist, um, and many of the other, well, it was very interdisciplinary, actually. We even had at that point an astrophysicist in the group with a good
Wow.
stats guy and so on. So we had some very interesting discussions
Mm.
early on. But in any case, I was mulling over what can I contribute to this? And suddenly it hit me, the aha moment that I've been researching at that point peace systems, and that I could really put a full thrust and work with these folks in the Sustaining Peace Systems project about what is a peace system and how
Hmm.
can we develop them and what are their characteristics and so
Hmm.
forth. So you're going to ask, what is a peace system? It's simply a clustering of neighboring societies that do not make war with each other. And then sometimes little parentheses, don't make war at all. That's
Mm.
one variation.
Mm.
And another one is, notice the definition, they don't make war with each other.
Mm.
In some cases, they do make war outside the peace
Hmm.
system.
Hmm.
There's both types, in other words. And an interesting question is, sort of look at the differences of those. So we have examples in this. Okay, let me just do it this way. 2021, we published in one of the leading journal families, the Nature journals,
Hmm.
an article that talks about the potential for peace systems to inspire cooperation in this sense, global cooperation or regional cooperation, whatever level. We look at it anthropologically. And by that, I mean, we're trying to find that the principles that are going on in social life in these peace systems. So how did they come about? How do they manage to do this? I mean, that's a big important
Hmm.
question.
Hmm.
How do clusters of neighboring societies manage
Hmm.
to maintain these peaceful relationships over time?
Hmm.
And we got some answers for this. So in 2021, it's open access. Anybody can go. I think I sent you the link real recently, and you
Hmm.
said you'd put
Hmm.
it up. It's a fun article. It even has pictures. And I say a little tongue in cheek, it's gotten 20,000 views, so
Nice.
it's
Yeah.
making quite an indent.
Mm.
The press picked up on it.
Mm.
I did multiple interviews with
Mm.
sources around the country and around the planet, interestingly, and it got syndicated and shared. So I'm not saying this just to be an egotist. I'm saying this because no, I'd like to be an egotist, but I have leveling
Yeah. Yeah.
pressures
Right.
put down on me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it just blew me away, honestly.
Hmm.
Here I am, an academic, an anthropologist, we get into this program. We got our astrophysicists, our psychologists, and the rest of the team. I put my students to work on it, gave them good responsibility, tried to be equal in that sense. You're going to become an expert on Switzerland, right? Yeah, okay.
Mm,
Now, if
mm,
they go to become an expert
mm,
on the Swiss peace system.
mhm,
So we really did a team effort. That's
mm,
partnership. But
mhm,
what blows me away is 20,000 views
mhm,
and all this media attention, perhaps even now more than 3 years ago.
mm, mm,
If you have some article that's talking about how can you create and maintain peace, thank goodness people are interested. But it
mhm,
really did blow me away
mhm.
as we just started getting all this attention from one article. That's never happened to me in my career, right?
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
oh yeah, another article by Fry, I will file that one. No, this one.
Mm,
So how do they do it? And I'll try to give you just a thumbnail of some of the interesting things.
mm,
Um, we compared non-peace system examples with a small number. I think it was 16 to be specific peace systems. And it's labor intensive to get all
mhm,
this data out of the historical sources, the political sources, or the ethnographic sources. So it's labor intensive. It took some years to do this with multiple people participating, as I said. So in comparing these two groups, peace systems tend to have peace leaders. That's a statistically significant difference between them. Peace leaders, of course, are those that talk about peace, try to promote peace, say peace is a good thing, etc. Another element, in fact, this was the most important, what we call peace norms and peace values.
mhm,
It's proper to be peaceful. It's proper to be
mhm,
peaceful.
mhm,
That's a desirable state. And again, we're extracting this out of text of different types, right, about the society, about the situation, members of the peace system, and then coding these things so that we could turn descriptions of peace systems into numbers and compare them with the descriptions of the non-peace systems and their numbers.
mm.
So, with my little memory check and to not remember something wrong, I printed out. Okay, so there were six variables that were strongly different. An overarching identity. So that's like, for instance, I no longer see myself as a North Carolinian, which I never really did, but I'm living here. So yeah, I'm from North Carolina.
Mhm,
I see myself also as a member of United States culture.
mhm,
That's two different levels of identity.
mhm,
And because I'm the guy I am, I also see myself as a world citizen. So
mhm, mhm,
overarching elements of identity is something peace systems have and encourage interconnectedness and just things as simple as how much intermarriage is taking place
mm,
amongst
mm,
this cluster of tribes
mm,
in
mhm,
Brazil that are living next to each other and not warring
mm,
and don't
mm,
war. A lot of intermarriage, for example.
mm,
Interdependence, we subdivided this into economic interdependence, environmental interdependence, and defense or defensive military interdependence. And here came a surprise out of it for me. Um, it seems many of the peace systems, not all, but many of them, come together and maintain that unity due to a fear of an outside threat of
mm,
some source.
mm, mm, mhm,
So that's a bit of a paradox, right?
mhm,
But again, come back to our definition of peace systems. They're clusters of neighboring societies that don't make war with each other, but they may fear war outside. And in some
mhm,
cases, some examples, they were engaged in war outside the
mhm,
system. So, I mean, you can play with these ideas, and I'm sidetracking for a second. We can play with them and start thinking, what are the implications?
mhm,
My wife Genevieve is thinking about region by region, going up from nations, reducing an international system in its complexity of actors and players and everything to more regional things that might sort of overlap and then go global, right?
mhm,
I'm more the go global guy, but um, different ways to play around with this.
mhm,
Ultimately, you end up with a world system where war is no longer a reality, and it's much more egalitarian and it's much more humane. It's
mhm.
partnership. And what is the reason for this? We all need each other.
Yeah,
We literally
yeah,
need each other.
yeah.
It does no good for some of us to reduce the emissions, and other countries just go on business as
Right,
usual. We're
exactly.
all going to sink or swim together. So there's so many interdependencies at this point.
Mhm.
Well, anyway, went off on my little side there. So there's the interconnections, the interdependencies, values and norms I mentioned, and then elements of symbolic culture were also very different. And by
Hmm.
this I mean ceremonies, symbols, rituals, narratives. In the peace systems, they were geared towards, guess what? Peace,
Hmm.
cooperation, getting along, things are good. The war system, geared towards a variety of other things, including war. So we also, just as a tag, we also looked at war values, war norms, and so forth, and they were significantly different the other way around.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's something quantitatively and qualitatively very different with the societies that manage to interact with their neighbors in a peace system without warfare. And I think it becomes contagious. So there's an
Hmm.
element of
Hmm.
hope.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if I'm right or not, but
Hmm.
again, an impression. More research needs to be done on that one. But it is a remarkable achievement, especially when you have neighbors who were previously at war with each other coming together and giving up war. An example we all know about, but may not have ever thought to call it a peace system, is the European Union,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
World War II, you just mentioned it, not that long ago. And now the idea that these European countries within the EU would have some sort of conflict with each other is basically, well, conflict, yes, but I mean, war
Totally.
is
Yeah.
just absurd.
Yeah.
And it's an overlapping, but it's a different system. We also consider the five Nordic countries and the Nordic territories there as being a peace system. And I didn't know this till I got into this research. Those Nordic countries have not gone to war with each other for over 200 years.
Mm.
Over
Wow.
200
Yeah.
years of non-war within that region of the Nordic land. And there's other ones, there's anthropological examples. I won't keep going, but I will say the Haudenosaunee, previously called
Mm-hmm.
Iroquois,
Hmm.
that's another
Hmm.
fascinating system involving myth and legend and explicitly peace leadership,
Hmm.
calling together the people. Let's give up these horrible ways of war. And also the security interdependence element comes in. There are
Hmm.
hostile tribes out beyond us. That would be safer for all of us if we did this. Switzerland, similarly, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a nice little film that we made about this too. That's I don't know if you watched it on the end of my email.
I think I watched parts of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just about 8 minutes long.
Yeah. Oh,
So
then I did watch the whole thing actually. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, that says with more artistic
Hmm.
flair
Hmm.
um, some of the things I've been saying right
Hmm.
now.
Yeah.
So that's been primarily my involvement. Peter Coleman, Larry Leibovich, Genevieve, my wife, some of our students, some of their students are all on this article together. So it's a nice example of partnership, looking at partnership.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, just the last bit here. I'd love to just kind of end on a hopeful note. And I think one of the things you just said kind of landed for me that way, which is that you have this experience of seeing or feeling that these peace systems are contagious. And I think about that with, I think most people are pro-social, even if they've been trained against it in particular ways. And I think the more sort of like antisocial behavior that we see, the more there's a response to that. And I don't know what, that's sort of what I see, at least when I'm like on social media or something, and everything is like, there's one element of like people are horrified by a thing, but it's also like a lot of people are horrified by this thing and are wanting to do stuff about it. And that is to me what gives me the most hope in terms of like dismantling systems of domination. And I'm wondering what your particular feelings are around that, especially in the given moment.
I have been that guy literally canvassing for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and I have been involved in so many group meetings, and I have written most recently for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and so forth. Um, I'm an academic. I think my work is pretty relevant in a variety of different ways.
Mhm.
Teacher, although now I'm retired. My favorite class, I would say, both for me and for the students, was the power of nonviolence, which I alluded to before.
Mhm.
So I think I know people have different talents and different insights. And I would just encourage anybody, as I have done with friends and my students and so forth, if it matters to you, then do something, and then find something that you feel comfortable with doing. Uh, Committing civil disobedience, that's not everybody's thing, but it's some people's thing, and that's important. And we go to Gene Sharp's list, find a few things in the
Mm,
198
mm,
tactics of nonviolence, how to throw out a dictator or bring positive social change that are good. And I personally think, look to your own talents and things you'd like to develop in yourself.
mhm.
Um, I've always wanted to develop my writing, so that was an easy one for me. Anything written, I like to get to that. I'm very sporadic with it, but I get to it sooner or later. The next one is that I've learned in my years is again back to partnership. Interestingly, do it with a group
Mhm.
because we are a social species, and individually. And again, it's not just personal reflection and talking to people. Not hard science, but maybe it's out there somewhere. You get depressed, right?
Mhm.
The burdens of the world, the burdens of
Mhm.
the current administration, and all that horrible nonsense and tragic stuff they're doing to this country. Yeah, it's easy to just want to go crawl back into your den or your cave or your bedroom or wherever you crawl into, right? Um, but when you have others working with you, somehow you can keep each other going. And I've seen this.
Mhm.
It's worked for me. I've done this. I'm not just blowing hot air. And I'm sure many of your listeners have had similar experiences. So when you get with like-minded people, you may succeed a little bit, or you may not succeed at all, but at least you've done what you can and you've
Mhm.
done it with other people and you've supported them and they've supported you. And very often it's a really uplifting feeling, as
Mhm.
imagine you felt yourself,
Mhm.
that you're working with others and doing something, you're giving it a good shot, giving it a good try. And there's never any guarantee of success, so forth. Uh, One of my real heroes, although I'd never had a chance to meet him, was Jean Monnet, who hardly anybody knows what he did or what it's about. But he was the key person, the peace leader
Mhm.
for the foundation of integrated Europe. We won't call it the European Union at that point, but he was the brainchild of forming this European coal and steel community, bringing six nations together and creating, of all things, a supranational body above the nations. And the key element was, as you may know the history, that France and Germany had long-standing conflicts and they had weapons produced. They needed coal, and they needed steel, and they often were fighting over the coal and steel region, which was along their border, and using this for industrialization in times of peace and also to produce military tanks and guns and everything else. So he created a supranational national authority. Key idea.
Mhm.
And so it went on from there, building momentum. So here's Europe. Every single European had just gone through this immense war right on their soil. Their infrastructure was a disaster. The train tracks had been pulled up and the bridges blown up, and people were literally starving in some parts of Europe at the end of the war. Um, it was just, it was like Gaza today, right?
Mhm.
But right there on European soil. And people were really ready for a change. And one thing Monet said that resonates with me is from crisis comes opportunity. So I'll leave it with that one.
Mhm.
Maybe we have enough crises and maybe we can turn it to opportunity, just as he and others were able to do to bring about a peaceful and prosperous Europe 70 some years
Mhm.
ago. And we might use that to our advantage with some of the issues that we're facing
Mhm.
right now.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes me think of another author that I really like. He's a native, half Native American, half Swiss, but also was adopted into a Mayan village in the 1980s. But he has a thing called crisis builds community, which, it's along
Yeah.
those similar lines, where there's a type of motivation that brings people together. And yeah, I feel that there's a lot of motivation right now. So,
Sure hope you're right.
well, Doug, thank you so much for coming on the Rewilding podcast. I feel like your work has been, a huge influence on the legitimacy of egalitarianism in terms of human societies. And I'm glad to have had the chance to chat with you face to face like this. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this with my listeners. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the nice compliment there, and thank you for the thanks. It's really been my pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my rewild workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thank you for listening.